Hey guys, this box just showed up today and I happen to know that it contains a radio shipped to me by a fellow collector. I thought I'd take this opportunity to show you how to properly pack a radio for shipment. So what we've got here is a large outer box, far larger than the actual radio. Inside we have a smaller box that actually contains the radio, surrounded by plenty of nice packing foam. What this will do is protect your merchandise as it gets kicked around by the shipping company of your choice, as the inner box will be floating around this nice foam padding. I'll pull out the inner box now and let's see what's inside. Alright, the radio seems to have survived intact. I was especially concerned about this glass dial face because I had another item shipped to me recently and it cracked quite badly. I ended up super gluing it back together, but the damage is quite visible. So what I've got here is a Motorola radio that does both shortwave and standard broadcast. I think it's from the early 40s. Cabinet's in pretty good shape. The front and bottom here are a faux burled walnut finish. It's in really good shape on the bottom here. Few minor dings up top, but I think a little artist acrylic paint, a fine tipped paintbrush, a little patience, and I can make that look presentable. Top can be refinished. Knobs are a bit stiff. I don't want to mess with them. I'll pull the chassis out and see what's up with that. Like the tuning doesn't want to tune. I think it's kind of cool that the logo on here is identical to the logo on the Motorola TVs I've got, so it's got to be from that same 40s era. And for the back, squeeze it by it. Somebody made a homemade cardboard back, but hey, why not? It's better than not having any back at all. I'll have to unscrew that to actually see what's inside. Okay, here's the chassis. Everything's looking pretty well intact. Here's the internal loop antenna. There's the tuning mechanism. All the tubes are present. Here's the 3-section electrolytic capacitor that I'll be replacing. It's a power transformer, audio output tube, and rectifier tube. I bet these tubes get pretty hot because they put a piece of asbestos wrapped around this corner here. It's probably to protect the wood cabinet from the hot tubes. Turns out there are a couple variations of this. According to the schematic I downloaded from Nostalgia Air, an HS-32 and an HS-67. Well, I've got it stamped right here, so I've got the HS-32. Looks to be a fairly simple radio. So basically, here's the antenna input, here's the tuning mechanism, here's the oscillator tube, here's the mixer where it combines the input from the antenna with the local oscillator. The difference frequency goes through the IF transformer to the IF amplifier to another coupling transformer to the detector and first audio amp, then the audio power amp, and then your speaker. And over here we have the rectifier and the electrolytic capacitors. So my plan is to pull the chassis out, check for any physical damage, and if I don't find any, to replace these electrolytics and try doing a slow power up, and maybe I'll get lucky and the paper caps aren't too far gone so that it'll play. Regardless, I will replace the paper capacitors eventually, but sometimes you can get lucky and it'll work just after replacing these electrolytics. The chassis came out easily enough thanks to the connector on the side for the internal antenna. All I had to do was unplug that, remove 2 screws, and the whole chassis came right out, because the speaker and the dial face are attached directly to the chassis. So just all one unit. Now for the bad. I noticed that the tuning dial or tuning knob wasn't turning when I had this inside the cabinet. Now I can see why. The tuning shaft, so I can get it the right at a good angle here, has been bent quite badly. I brought out a little gentle persuasion to see if I can knock it back into position. Haha, good news. It's working fine. In the end, I actually did not need to use the hammer. I just got it so that the biggest deflection was pointing up, and I put my palm on it and pushed down gently and firmly and was able to bend it back. And then I slowly rotated it to try to find any further eccentricities or bends in the shaft, and kept deflecting it down with my hand and being very careful not to break off this bearing point here, and it seems to be working fine now. So as you can see, as this rotates, this big wheel goes around, which is attached to the tuning capacitor, and through these cords here it slides this back and forth. On either side of this dial is a light bulb here, so I expect when this is powered up, this whole face should be nicely illuminated. Now, as for the electronics, it's actually pretty simple underneath, like I thought it would be from the schematic. So in spite of the large size of this radio, and it actually is a lot larger than I thought it would be based on the pictures I had seen on eBay of similar sets. Well, I guess, part of that is there's a lot of dead space in here. For whatever reason, I guess the size must have been dictated by the diameter of the speaker and the size of the dial, and they just made the chassis big enough to accommodate them, and then there's plenty of room to fit the components down here. So what have we got? Well, let's see, this is the audio output transformer. A couple of paper caps here on what I believe is the tone control. This is the on-off volume control down here. A few more paper caps here. 1, 2 mica caps. There's a ceramic cap. Ceramic caps like this and mica caps like that rarely go bad, so I always leave those for last, and to be honest, I've never actually had to replace any in a radio. Paper cap here, 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 and here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 10 paper caps in all to replace. Not too bad at all. They all seem to be fairly accessible. So, I know I said I was going to replace the electrolytic and then try powering it up, but what the heck, they're all easily accessible. I've got spares on hand, or replacements I should say, so I'm just going to go ahead and recap this whole thing. Shouldn't take too long at all. Let's see, where's the, oh, here's the 3-section electrolytic. I'm just going to clip these leads and tack some temporary replacement capacitors in place, rather than removing the capacitor and trying to restuff it right now. I finished the recapping. It was fairly uneventful. I also found a couple resistors that were out of spec and replaced those. Like this should have been a 22 ohm resistor and it was measuring 54 ohms, so I replaced that. One thing I wanted to mention about the electrolytic capacitor on this radio, it's this metal can here. Well, this can is not grounded. It is not attached to the chassis. This is an insulating wafer here. That's fairly common on radios. They would do that to develop a negative bias that was needed for some of the tubes. You can see that on the schematic here. Here's the 3-section capacitor. This bar here is the common negative of that capacitor. If you follow that lead, you'll see that it goes through a 270 ohm resistor and then a 39 ohm resistor, and then through this resistor, which varies depending on the model. In this case it's 22 ohms, and then ground. The reason they did that was at these various pickoff points here, there'll be negative voltages that feed these various tubes here. Basically, it's an easy way to generate some negative voltage without having to have a separate tap and rectifier on the transformer. So when you replace these electrolytics, do not take the negative terminal and just connect it right to the chassis. It needs to be floating. Alright, so that being said, I've got a voltmeter attached to the main filter capacitor here, and I've rigged up a crude antenna because if you recall, the antenna is actually attached inside the cabinet via this plug. So we'll power this up while monitoring this voltage. Well, see, I got the nice light bulbs here lighting up this display dial here. The voltage shot up nicely, and then you see it's dropping. It peaked at about 400 or so, and then it drops down. That's commonly what happens on these radios, is the rectifier will sometimes start conducting before the other tubes, so the voltage spikes. Then as the other tubes warm up and start drawing current, the voltage drops down. That's why it's a good reason, even though they only spec these capacitors out at 300 or 350 volts, I put 450s in there because I saw that spike up to 400. Alright, so voltages dropped down and stabilized there, that's good. Don't hear anything, but I don't these controls a little bit. Now, this does both shortwave and broadcast band. I looked on the cabinet, and this is the broadcast band. And dirty control. I haven't cleaned the controls yet on this, so use some keg deoxit once I get this radio working. Well, I see this is tone control, and this is volume, I believe. Alright, I can hear something. Let's tune this in. Maybe a stronger station. Of course, I don't have the greatest antenna either. Oh yeah.
And this is a club that does feed off of their home field as probably as well as anybody in baseball. You know, when they get a little run going, go back a couple years ago when they had that tremendous run to get to the World Series.
Yeah, tone control's working. So there's more trouble.
Over the years, so probably a little more than most.
There's more bass.
Some choice in lefty or going with
Yeah, well, we were certainly looking at the way the lineup and kind of a little shorthanded and
maximum volume's a little weak. Probably two reasons for that. One is my little,
later in the inning.
well, you can already hear my little half-assed antenna here is not a proper antenna. Also, the 6K6 audio output tube, when I tested it, was on the borderline of being good. But I believe I do have a new old stock one somewhere, so I'm going to dig that up. Alright, so now that it's working... Oh, let's try the shortwave band. Probably won't hear anything. It is nighttime, and that's important, because during the day, I believe shortwave reception isn't so hot. But, again, I don't really have a proper antenna, but... What the hell? Let's see if I can pick anything up. Plus, I have no idea what stations might exist on shortwave other than 10 megahertz. I'm actually kind of curious to see if I can get that in. I believe on 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 megahertz, there's a government broadcast that sends out some digital beeps and I believe a time signature. That's one of the most accurate time and frequency references in the world. It's controlled by an atomic clock. I know they have a transmitter in, I think, Boulder, Colorado, and I think there's one on the West Coast somewhere too. I made this little solid-state radio years ago to pick that up, and I was able to hear those tones. It was kind of cool. It's the first radio I ever built by hand, from scratch. So I'll be curious to see if I can pick it up on this radio. So let's see, it should be right around here. Hey, I'll hook up a real antenna and see if this radio works any better.